Good afternoon, everybody. I am Guillaume van der Loo, Research Fellow at the European Policy Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our policy dialogue on transatlantic trade relations and the challenges for the Trade and Technology Council that we organized together with the US mission to the EU. It is a busy day in the Brussels bubble, and we don't want to steal the thunder of President von der Leyen or her State of the Union speech. But today is actually also the perfect timing to discuss the challenges for transatlantic trade relations and the Trade and Technology Council. As you may know, in 2 weeks' time, on 29th of September, the first TTC meeting will take place. The TTC was established as one of the key deliverables during the EU-US summit in June. During this summit, the EU and the new Biden administration were quite enthusiastic to leave the Trump days behind and set an ambitious joint agenda for transatlantic cooperation, mainly in the interrelated areas of trade, digital, and climate. Now, there is obviously a lot of work on the plate of the TTC and its 10 working groups, as it aims to cover a wide range of issues from cooperation on technology standards, global trade challenges, supply chains, climate and green tech, data governance, investment screening, export controls, and so on and so forth. And obviously also with the TTC, the EU and US aim to establish or create a kind of united transatlantic front to counter China's rise in these sectors. However, despite the enthusiastic vibe or atmosphere in Brussels and in Washington for this new transatlantic trade agenda, the EU and US will first need to overcome different views or even a few trade disputes or irritants, some, but not all of them inherited by the previous administration in the US. For example, at bilateral level, we now have a broad, maybe a bit vague agreement on Airbus and Boeing, but as you may know, the Section 232 tariffs on EU steel and aluminium are still around, and the EU's rebalancing measure, or the second tranche of it, will kick in on the 1st of December. Other challenges relate to digital taxation, data transfer, new Buy American policies by the Biden administration, and for example, recently the CBAM proposal by the European Commission. And at the multilateral level, ahead of the WTO ministerial conference later this year, the EU and US will need to agree on an agenda for WTO reform, including hopefully on the appellate body and how to address common concerns vis-à-vis China, such as state-owned enterprises and on subsidies. Other challenges related to the TCC will be on how to give it a parliamentary dimension, how to involve all stakeholders. And actually, EPC and Egmont just published a report on all these issues, which you can find on our website. However, today we are very fortunate and pleased to have truly a stellar panel to discuss these challenges for transatlantic trade with key experts and also senior officials from both sides of the Atlantic that will be involved in the work of the TTC. So we are very pleased to have with us Mr. Daniel Mullaney. Mr. Mullaney is Assistant US Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East. Please correct me if I'm wrong, I think already since 2010. And in this capacity, he's also responsible, obviously, for developing and implementing US trade policy vis-à-vis the European Union. We also have Mr. Rupert Schlegelmilch from the European Commission with us. Rupert is Deputy Director General at DG Trade, leading, among others, the Directorate on the Americas and Agriculture, and will also play an important role in the Trade and Technology Council. We also have Mr. Bernd Lange with us, Chair of the INTA Committee in the European Parliament, but also dealing specifically with EU-US trade relations. For example, recently as rapporteur on an opinion for INTA on future EU-US relations. And we're also thrilled to have with us Jennifer Hillman. She's currently Senior Counsel Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Professor at Georgetown University. But Jennifer had a very distinguished career in public service, for example, including within the office of the USTR, and she was also a member of the appellate body. So without further ado, I propose, Mr. Mullaney, that you kick off. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Guillaume, and it's a real pleasure to be on a panel with Rupert and Bernd and Jennifer. I had the pleasure of actually having an IR, what they call an IRL meeting with Rupert and Bernd over the last few days. So that was a great pleasure. But it's always good to be together, even digitally. As you mentioned, Guillaume, at the US-EU Trade Summit in June, Presidents Biden, von der Leyen, and Michel established the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. the overall objective of which is to drive a transatlantic digital transformation that spurs trade and investment, strengthens our technological and industrial leadership, boosts innovation, protects and promotes critical and emerging technologies and infrastructure. We plan to cooperate on the development and deployment of new technologies based on our shared democratic values, including respect for human rights that encourage compatible standards and regulations. What does this mean? I think most on the call here recognize that the United States and the European Union jointly possess a huge trove of shared democratic values: openness, transparency, rule of law, basic fairness, non-discrimination, worker rights, and respect for diversity that we have jointly to preserve and to grow, not just domestically, but also globally. We can't just hold these values closely and preserve and protect them. We need to promote them globally to make sure they grow and to guard them from threats from competing values. And we need to do that together. We also have to recognize that we do have differences between us, of course. Despite our shared values, not all of our interests, not all of our priorities overlap. And in addition, our institutional structures and the way we each regulate are not mirror images of each other. And this can create divergences of views and, frankly speaking, sometimes misunderstandings on a range of topics, especially in the trade area, which is the subject matter that I know best. We are all, I think, very familiar, or we think we are, with all of the differences, in part because that's what tends to get the attention. But the truth is that what divides us is nothing really compared to what unites us. And the challenges that we face bilaterally are minor compared to the global challenges that we face together. So with this as background, the Trade and Technology Council, and here I'm frankly going to be speaking mostly about the global trade challenges aspects of the TTC. It's a strong opportunity to strengthen and to grow our transatlantic ties in the area of trade and technology, and to ensure that the values underlying those ties are projected internationally. And we're very focused, as is our leadership, on making real and concrete progress in all of these areas. The TTC represents a unique opportunity to do this. I would mention maybe 3 areas of focus in particular. First is the challenge to our economies and to the global trading system presented by particular non-market policies and practices, such as state-supported excess capacity, subsidies, non-market activities of state-controlled enterprises, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and forced labor, among other things. We can't have a world in which our workers and our companies are called upon to compete with the economic and political power of large state actors or against competitors that use forced labor. It's not fair to us, and it's not right for the workers. Second is our shared commitment to maintaining our transatlantic global technological leadership and competitiveness. That means building and preserving a strong, innovative, and competitive transatlantic economic marketplace in which free and fair competition thrives, unnecessary obstacles to the transatlantic marketplace are avoided, and innovation is encouraged and protected. And third, and this is especially key, this is a transatlantic marketplace that promotes the welfare of workers, of regular people, and disadvantaged communities, and others that are at risk of being left behind, and that advances workers' rights at home and internationally. For us, I think this is what it means to work together to make sure that, especially in the area of new and emerging technologies, the rules of the global economy continue to embrace democratic values, market-based competition, transparency, and the rule of law. So this is what we're aiming to achieve, and in particular in the Global Trade Challenges Working Group. With respect to the overall process and status of this TTC working group, we started work immediately after the June 15th summit, established the TTC, and I can personally attest it literally started minutes after the meetings in Brussels to get the process up and running and to make sure it fulfills the promise to deliver concretely on these objectives. On the US side, the TTC is co-chaired by US Trade Representative Tai, Secretary of Commerce Raimundo, and Secretary of State Blinken. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience that Ambassador Tai is extremely focused on ensuring that all trade initiatives, including trade aspects of the TTC, are worker-centric, that they address the needs of real people and of communities that have been left behind, and that they reflect the views of all of these interests. So this will be our guiding principle as we work toward concrete outcomes with our EU colleagues. Telescoping out more broadly on the process, I should note that USTR, which is the agency that I am employed by, is participating in several other TTC working groups that will focus on issues and challenges with implications for transatlantic trade. This includes a group on climate and clean technology, which USTR is co-leading, as well as groups focused on technology standards cooperation, small and medium-sized enterprise access to digital tools and technologies, and secure supply chains. Each group is going to proceed on its own pace and work towards its own concrete goals. And we will, from our part, of course, welcome at every stage but broad participation from a broad and inclusive range of stakeholders. Periodically, US and the EU co-chairs are going to meet to assess the progress of the various working groups. My final point is that the first meeting of the co-chairs, as many of you probably know, will be on September 29th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We chose Pittsburgh as the venue for this meeting because it is transitioning from a center of heavy manufacturing into a hub for technology and cutting-edge industry by investing in itself and its workers, including by building ties with the European partners. I think I will stop there, Guillaume and fellow panelists, and I look very much forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dan, for setting the scene. Obviously, you mentioned a lot of issues that we will delve into later on. But now, first, I give the floor to Rupert for the EU side or the Commission side of things.
Thank you, Guillaume. And I can, I think, seamlessly continue. First of all, thanking you for having us here and thanking Dan for setting the scene in such a comprehensive way. I will maybe zoom in on a few aspects because I don't want to repeat everything that has been said by maybe pointing out, before we get to the TTC, look at the context a little bit. And I would invite you, if you're interested in transatlantic relations, to look at the summit statement of 15th of June. By way, as far as political declarations goes, this is one of the most ambitious documents I've ever seen. Obviously, with a side of relief on our side, I can say that we were back in business in a trusted relationship, which, as you know, for Europeans historically has always been very important. But for the future will be just as important because the geopolitics are changing quite quickly, and during some of the past years, it was quite lonely for Europe out there, if you wish, on certain issues. I think I can say that. So the declaration builds on a clear policy orientation the Commission put out in December 2020 of the new transatlantic agenda, trying to make the best of our respective tools to work together. And trade is one of the issues, but I really want to underline that all of this has to be seen in a context of where we will cooperate on many other issues, climate change, the Green Deal, and so on, issues which are really important for our common future. Now, in the trade area, we have, of course, a long history. And before we talk about the TTC, the first questions I always get in discussions like this is, what about these high visible conflicts? And I think this is also part of the bigger landscape we've been able to solve, at least temporarily, as you said, Guillaume. We have put some of the tariff wars on aircraft behind us, although this was a legal debate to a large extent. It was not a unilateral measure, but we had a long litigation which didn't lead to much except more pain on both sides. And now we're finally trying really to solve the underlying issues. And we also started a very, I think, constructive discussion on what to do with the remaining tariffs, which are part of the US national security, what we call Section 232 in our jargon measures. And we haven't solved it yet, but we have made a gesture, which otherwise, I think, if the summit hasn't been such a positive element, would not have taken place, which is that we have held back on some of the retaliation rights that we think we have in order to level the playing field. So that's where we started. And that's where the TTC comes in. And the summit statement it's very clear that we are trying to develop a common vision of what we need to do in a post-pandemic scenario where we are all rattled by the fact that not only did we have many more problems in the past in the international economic system, we also had then the pandemic, and that I think focused everybody's mind to say the US and the EU must do better together, given the challenges, be it the pandemic or be it, as Dan has just said, the way that the economic international order has been developed in the last 10 years with a strong focus or a strong growing influence of non-market aspects. And I'm not talking about one country only. We have to really make sure that our joint belief that markets should be open, contestable, competition is good, and so on. Now, we all have issues in the past where we disagreed on some of that aspects of these policies. You know, we had long-standing complaints in the past on our agriculture policy from the US. We had long-standing complaints on some of the aspects of US policy. But all of that, I think, is really dwarfed by the fact that we need to do and make sure that in particular the digital space, the trade, economic digital space, the nexus between technology and trade, digital development, and also national security to some extent, is discussed in a comprehensive manner. And this is exactly what the TTC should do. It should really try to make our political leader find a space, or have them find a space to drive forward an agenda which puts a clear marker down that we can do these things together. And this is not just the digital transition, it's also issue that Dan had mentioned, or that will be mentioned in the discussion. If you look at the 10 working groups, and they are, you know, they're in the mission statement, in the declaration. You can see that we are going very broad, because you have working groups on issues like climate and clean tech. You have working groups on secure supply chains, which itself is a huge debate now. You have data governance and tech platforms. I mean, what more can be, you know, said? And this is obviously a very interesting debate. But we also have more classical export control, investment screening discussions, and so on. So it's really a very comprehensive platform to make cooperation work in areas which are becoming more and more important, and not only for business, but also for citizens. Think about the whole question of the digital data exchanges, the way consumer protection could work in the transatlantic market space. And for our NGOs who really want to also leverage the technology and the knowledge in the EU and the US for a cleaner future, if you wish. So it's a very broad agenda, and now we have to make sense of it. And that is, of course, now where we come to the fact that we have a meeting coming up. And what we will do and what we are doing right now, if you go back to the summit declaration and you see that the 10 working groups which are named there, you will, of course, see that somebody has to do some groundwork. And right now we're trying to scope out what actually can be done in these working groups to focus, because one thing that we want to avoid is to have a talk shop or a body that doesn't work. And there are many cynics around to say so many things have been tried between the EU and the US, and none of them have really worked the way we wanted, be it a big trade negotiation, be it a transatlantic agenda, which many years ago was the logo. In between, we had the Transatlantic Economic Council and so on. I think we really want to believe, and we do believe, that this time it's different. We really have a much more focused and clear idea what can be done and what cannot be done, because some things are obviously will remain different between the two jurisdictions, but we can limit, even in those, I think, areas, we can give it a good try to limit the discrepancy and make things complementary and coherent as much as we can. That is a little bit the idea, and we are now having these 10 working groups who are trying to set their agenda. The principals will meet to look at all of that in 2 weeks' time. This is, as Dan has said, it's Secretary Blinken, Secretary Raimondo, and Ambassador Tai. On the US side, it will be the Executive Vice Presidents Vestager and Dombrovskis on our side, to give direction to this work. So to really see, okay, here's a large menu. First of all, are there things we can do immediately? And secondly, what are the midterm things we should really focus on? So that our teams, people like me who actually try to implement many of these things, get a clear sense of direction, what is expected. And all of that will be done, and this I think is extremely important to mention, with a rolled out stakeholder involvement. You won't have seen much of that yet because it's also new. You mentioned, Guillaume, the civil society dialogue before we logged on. I mean, we have our tools to get input, but there will be much more happening after the first inaugural event, if you wish, in Pittsburgh, to make sure that all our stakeholders, meaning unions, consumers, the business, small and big business, everybody will have a way to influence this process in order to make sure that we talk about the right things in these discussions. That is as far as we are right now. We will then see how this format will actually work. But it's clear that the appetite on both sides of the Atlantic is for output and a much better discussion on many of the issues where we didn't have a chance to discuss in the past. I'll stop here because obviously the heart of the matter is a debate in meetings like this. So I'll hand over back to you. Thank you, Guillaume.
Many thanks, Rupert, for helping us seeing the wood for the trees. And again, I'm sure that we will pick up on many issues that you mentioned. But now I give the floor to Bernd for a view from Strasbourg from Parliament. So please, Bernd, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Guillaume. And you made the introduction of my position, but you forgot that I'm the standing rapporteur to the trade relation with the United States. And in this function, I was also responsible for the TTIP negotiation, and I spent a lot of my lifetime in this negotiation and got some kind of experience from that. And this is perhaps also relevant for the discussion we have now. Let me make 4 remarks before coming to the TTC. First, there is really a change in the relations. So hearing a few weeks ago when I was in Washington, speaking from alliance, partnership, open, frank discussion, it totally changed compared to the previous government. And this is, I guess, really the basis for creating a new partnership in also trying to find some compromise in some outstanding issues. Secondly, we are sharing really common values and specifically looking to the workers and wages, as Catherine Tai mentioned, is really also key for us to look who has benefit of trade, who has benefit of relations, is really interest on both sides of the Atlantic. And this is also a really good starting point for a new kind of relations. Thirdly, in a good partnership, it's also clear that we have different views on several items. And we have some irritation still on the table. Rupert mentioned some of them. The question of the steel tariffs are really crucial for the steel workers in my constituency. So they asked me, what is the interest of the steel workers in the United States compared to our interests, and can we find a common view on steel production? So, and we have the question of the Buy America Act and the public procurement issue. And we have also the question how to be engaged in the WTO to modernize the multilateral trading system. So there are some irritations and conflicts, different interests there. But it's clear that we really are now able to speak about these different interests and find a way out of this and find a way to de-escalate. And this is a really good approach on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's also clear that this TTC is not the platform to solve these irritations. This has to be clear as well. And fourth remark, TTC is not TTIP. And it's also not a TTIP 2.0. even today in the debate on the State of the Union, some of my colleagues mentioned this. This TTC is the starting point of a new comprehensive trade agreement. I don't think so, and we should not overload this, because regarding a comprehensive trade agreement, we need on our side a mandate from the Council. We have to, in Parliament, had to discuss it. Then on your side, you need a trade promotion authority and so on. I guess this is not the time to discuss a comprehensive trade agreement for several reasons. So TTC is quite different. It's a platform to discuss, let's say, the low-hanging fruit of cooperation, which is necessary for business and society. And I guess we should really agree on this format as a discussion platform. And Rupert mentioned the 10 or 11 working groups where several items should and could be discussed. And I hope very much that the attempt to get really results is still in the air and not forgotten during the discussion process. So I would really recommend to have a clear timeline when the different working groups could have a result. That's really important, I guess, for giving a positive mood to this platform. We had so many different discussion processes with the United States, TTIP, and before the Tech Council and some other elements as well, without quite limited results. So let's really focus on the low-hanging fruits and make clear in which time the concrete elements could reach. And then, of course, it's clear that the European Parliament is really deeply involved in the exercise in the scrutiny process for several reasons. I guess this is also a lesson learned from TTIP. We need transparency. There is still a suspect against the discussion about trade issues in general, but also between the United States and the European Union. And we have in our intercommittee a US monitoring group where I'm the chair of, and we are scrutinizing very close the process of this platform and the 10 or 11 working groups. And of course, based on the European treaties, we have the same right as the Council has, and we are looking for this same footing quite intense. So we will be on board. And of course, we also have contacts to our counterparts in the United States. As I mentioned, I was in Washington end of July, speaking to Richard Neal, to Blumenauer in the Congress, to the Senate. I guess that this parliamentarian dimension is for a success, I guess, also quite important, and we will continue in this dialogue. And one additional element, I guess, is important. Apart from business, who are really interested, and today I joined a discussion where a representative from IBM was part, and they are really keen on this, on the digital area, of course. But I guess we should really look for the involvement of the unions. And I agreed with Catherine Tai on that, the people on the ground should have a say as well, so that we can make sure that the benefit of trades is really come to the common people. We need them on board, in principle, of course, but also to not lose any support, any public support in our relations. And therefore, I guess this is has a direct consequences if the TTC has really an impact on citizens life. And of course, regarding the data protection systems and privacy of data, and so this might have a direct impact. So trade unions, in my point of view, are also really important. By the way, I read, of course, this Egmont paper carefully, and the idea to have a look also to third countries, to perhaps create a group of observers, I guess is quite an interesting idea, and also to look for cooperation with like-minded countries on some technical standards as well. You mentioned it as a committee on tech standards. It's perhaps a little bit high level, but to have this dialogue also to the outside world beside the United States and European Union might be also useful. And of course, the biggest priority is the really good contact to our counterparts. And personally, I can say I have a really good relationship with Catherine Tai, and I appreciate this very much, so that we have a direct link to each other. And I hope that we can really continue on this and base really the parliamentarian dimension on this. And I will organize also some roundtable with my committee on the TTC with my American counterparts in the near future.
Okay, many thanks, Bernd. The contributions so far reflected quite the positive atmosphere during the summit, and with the focus on setting priorities, for example. But now, Jennifer, as an expert, but more outside the involvement of the TTC, yeah, the floor is yours to shed your light on these issues. And obviously, there are many issues to cover, but you have carte blanche.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor for me to join this august group. I think I am carrying the mantle of the least informed of anyone on this panel, but maybe hopefully a little bit of an honest broker between my government friends from the European Union and from the United States. I wanted to focus on 4 issues where, to me, there ought to be quick, broad, and deep convergence between the United States and the European Union. Yet right now there's not, or not enough, not yet. And I will say I was very pleased to listen to this discussion, that I think there's a lot of agreement that these issues ought to be among the top agenda items in a number of the specific TCC working groups. And I'm going to start first and foremost with the issue of climate change, which to me is the most important and at the same time the most frustrating. Because the United States and the European Union agree on the end goal, net zero emissions by 2050, and both sides have committed to that end. The problem is that the two sides are not likely to get there through the same mechanisms, and it's the different path to the same place that raises all these major concerns and issues that need to be addressed immediately, both because of the imperative of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also because I think this is the single most important issue for restoring enduring trust between the United States and the European Union. My former colleague at the German Marshall Fund, Bruce Stokes, recently wrote a piece called, that in the eyes of the EU's next generation, it's the climate change stupid, as he put it, that the issue raises far more concerns than fights over Afghanistan or other issues on the question of whether the US will really follow through with its commitments to combat climate change as what is absolutely essential to restoring trust between the United States and the European Union. And I think the concern is that for the Biden administration and to some degree it appears now the Congress, the United States is likely to achieve its climate change goals through a combination of incentives, often in the form of subsidies, and regulation, again, including its goal of a carbon-free electricity sector by 2035. But what it is not likely to do, or at least appears to be on the path of, is focusing on price-based mechanisms. And yet you turn over to the European Union side and you see an emissions trading system that is heavily, again, a price-based mechanism that will now be applied at the border. And so my worry is, again, these two different paths to get to the same place end up resulting in the potential for, significant conflict over border adjustment mechanisms, border taxes, with now the United States looking at the idea of imposing a border mechanism, but based not on a price for carbon in the United States or a tax on domestic producers, but on the cost of complying with a panoply of environmental regulations, which simply invites this question of, is that really fair? Is the border adjustment tax going to be done in a way that actually is measurable, quantifiable, consistent? And so to me, I think the United States and the European Union need to start talking right now about the prospect of a peace clause, where we would agree to sort of find interesting and different ways of examining what each other is doing to assess whether or not these really are sort of fair, neutral, non-trade protectionist measures applied on both sides. But to me, this is really one of the urgent issues. The second issue that I'm going to touch on that was sort of alluded to in a lot of the comments is the issue of a response to China, including where China is as the world's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, but also China as the leading producer of renewable energy products. Both the US and the European Union share a lot of concerns over China's increasingly aggressive actions, its potential for its One Belt, One Road lending to undermine macroeconomic stability and saddle countries all this debt. We see this in Montenegro and other places right within right outside the borders of the European Union. Its continued subsidization of privileged market access for state-owned and non-market economies, its dominance in a number of technologies and in the technology standard-setting organizations, its continued reliance on the export of coal-fired power plants. I mean, across a wave of issues, forced labor in Xinjiang, on. There is I think, a convergence of concerns, yet coming together between the United States and the European Union to respond to China has become more elusive than perhaps it should be, in part because I think there is some disagreements within some of the EU member states about what's the right approach to China. And in part on the US side, I think some lasting legacy of the Trump administration's go it alone approach, in which we unilaterally imposed tariffs and then entered into a phase one agreement where the heart and soul of that agreement is to tell China to buy more from the United States, which arguably means buy less from Europe and other places. And the combination of those two, I think, has made it harder for the US and the EU to get on the same page in terms of how to respond to China. Yet cooperation on China, to me, is, again, one of those really high priority critical issues. And I would throw out the one area where the US and the EU should start right now on China. And that is in the issue of sort of a common approach to pushing China on its lending practices. If you step back and look at it, where is the sort of Communist Party gaining control within China? It is a shift. You see it in the Belt and Road, but you see it elsewhere, away from a lot of the hard infrastructure that had been there to technology. And that includes financial technology, telecommunications technology, healthcare technology, and in finance. This is where the Communist Party is gaining, is in the finance area. And where the US and the EU could clearly get together is on pushing lending practices that are transparent and that address a lot of the environmental issues. Again, there was an agreement on green investment principles. There is agreement on green investment principles. So again, the US and the EU could do so much if they could really get together to push China to adhere to those kind of green investment principles. The third issue, again, is one that I'm not going to dwell on because so much of the discussion this morning has been there other than to echo the incredible importance of getting together on technology and technology standards. Again, it's already been said, and that is obviously the heart and soul of what the TTC is going to do. But again, my sense is that that this is extremely important to get it right, and I would urge greater emphasis. I think my concern is on two places where you're starting to already see some divergence. One is on the issue of competition policy around technology, where the EU seems to be going much more in the direction of restricting or cabining into some degree what a small number of tech giants can do, or imposing digital services taxes, again, on a small number of very large companies, whereas the US seems to be starting down a path more of breaking up some of these companies. And again, this is one where I just want to flag that we need to be sort of more on the same place. And again, the other one to me where there needs to be more working together is in the standard setting area, where we have seen, again, a huge push by China to develop, particularly in the telecommunications area, telecommunications standards that are not supportive of where the United States and Europe are in terms of an open internet, in terms of sort of plug and play, sort of O-RAN kind of technology where components can come from Europe or the United States, services can come from one to the other and still be used within these networks. That is not the direction in which the standards are going. That's not the direction in which things are moving, and where again, we need this kind of digital agreements to come about. And that is going to mean solving the data privacy issues and solving them early, because that's where, to me, in this technology debate, the US and the European Union remain sort of at loggerheads. It's not just the aftermath of the Schrems case, but across the board, the privacy issues have got to come sort of to the top of the agenda and not get in the way of reaching an agreement. And the last one I'm going to touch on is one that maybe people here don't want to hear, but I think this is where the European Union and the United States need to, again, push it to the top of the agenda, and that's WTO reform. Europe has done a lot of work and put out a lot of proposals. And in my own view, the United States is at this point treading water. And that's not an acceptable solution. And again, part of that needs to be to think about why do we need the WTO? I mean, there's been a lot of calls for maybe we should develop some other pact of democratic, market-oriented economies to leave aside the WTO. That may be a perfectly good idea. We don't have time. We do not have time to try to create an alternative to the WTO. We need to fix the WTO, and we need to fix it fast. Why? Because the WTO has got to be contributing to the fair, effective, and efficient manufacturing, distribution of vaccines and other things needed to fight the pandemic. The WTO has got to be in that fight. The WTO has got to be in this peace clause fight notion over how to solve climate change. And there is just still a remaining significant number of issues that cannot be addressed, no matter how good US-EU cooperation is, no matter how much work the TPP can do. There are just a series of issues that can only be addressed at the global level. Intellectual property, it's going to move across all borders. You cannot do that just on a bilateral basis. Digital in general, these digital regulations about an open internet and a transparent system have got to be done at the global level. Trade facilitation, transparency, there just are a whole series of issues, even trade in services. There simply isn't a way that you're going to do trade and services without a more global approach to how to do those rules. So I think as much as this may want to be pushed off, I think the Global Trade Challenges Committee that Dan is chairing, that Ignacio is working on, needs to spend a little bit more time thinking about ways in which we could come together on reforming the WTO. And again, that reform can be very consistent with this worker-centric approach to trade. There's a lot that can be done within that WTO reform agenda that would absolutely speak to all of the points that both Dan and Rupert and Bernd have made. And with that, I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Jennifer, for really delving into the substance, because first we discussed mainly the institutional setup of the TTC and the priorities, and you really brought in the key challenges and really the substance. So actually, I prepared and I have many questions myself, but I will hold my horses because we have almost 200 participants. So I invite the participants to ask in the chat box their questions, but please briefly state your name and your affiliation in the chat box, and keep your questions obviously short and snappy so that I can see the wood for the trees. But while we are waiting for a couple of questions, maybe Let me nevertheless ask myself first a couple of questions. So many thanks, Jennifer, on flagging really with regard to substance, the priorities, China, climate, technology, WTO reform, and obviously these are all related. And picking up on WTO reform, a question is to all speakers, is the ministerial conference coming maybe a bit too early? Can the EU and the US already really develop some joint proposals by the ministerial conference, not specifically on, for example, the appellate body, but really on, for example, linking this to China, on the common concerns that they have vis-a-vis China? Because, for example, both the EU and the US didn't really manage to extract concessions from China in their respective agreements, for example, on subsidies, not in the CAI or in the phase one agreements. And if you look, for example, at the work of the trilaterals with Japan, these went much further. So is there the possibility, or is it realistic already, that the EU and US can cooperate on that and really to have already proposals ready by the ministerial conference? And what would be the main challenges on that? And then maybe second question with regard to really more going back to the institutional setup of the TTC. We have Bernd obviously flagging the importance of the European Parliament, but how and to what extent would also obviously the member states and the council will they be involved? Because of course it's a bit different, this TTC, than a joint body under an international agreement where you have a commission proposal and then the council adopts a decision. So is there already, I don't know, a blueprint on how to involve the council, especially if we really go to the next step on implementation of really legislation within the EU, or going to a commission proposal for an international agreement? So maybe we can start with these two questions. I don't know if somebody wants to come in and break the ice.
Guillaume, I'm happy to kick off if it's to the panelists you asked the questions, and maybe because on WTO we have been banking on Jennifer to take up the issue. I mean, it's certainly part of our standard narrative that we need EU-US leadership to reform the WTO, and everything that Jennifer has said on this, I didn't say because I knew she was going to say it. Sorry, this is a little bit overstating the issue, but we actually realize that the international economic system, because of the reasons you mentioned, we don't have much time. I also think that an alternative to the WTO would not be fit for purpose, because the whole point of the WTO is to be universal. And you need China in an international organization, to put it bluntly. And you can, of course, work around some of these difficult issues, but it's not going to be as effective if you try to leverage the discussion with everyone around the table. And we know that there's a lot of skepticism on the US side whether the issues they have, in particular with this particular country, but also with some other non-market players, can be efficiently addressed or not within the WTO. Does it really help us is the question that we're getting. It's slow, it's the lowest common denominator. Our view is we have to try all our tools. Some instances you need to work bilaterally, but if you want to have a long-term predictable situation, which is based on international law, and which also, I think, not only brings in like-minded, but really sets the global standard, you need the global organization. It's very simple. We haven't found the key yet to this, to be quite honest, and we are slightly nervous because time for the next ministerial is not there. It's not that we are not engaged, the United States is not engaged, but I think we could do much better to work on some of these issues in order to work on climate issue. I mean, we would like to really see a health initiative work in the WTO, or climate and environment issues to be addressed much more forcefully in WTO. I think because that's where I think the biggest benefit would come from joint action. So I think that's a given. I can't tell you whether MC12 comes too early. It's already been, I think, later than we thought. But it's true that without EU-US leadership, let's put it like that, the results promise to be maybe slightly below our expectations, to put it mildly. You also asked me a question, again, I don't want to monopolize the time, but it's more or less addressed to us. So this is the internal working of the EU. Again, if there were implementing acts, agreements, legislation, we would follow the normal method. We would make a proposal for a negotiating mandate, we'd go to council, we'd consult the parliament and so on. Right now, we're talking about a political platform to set things in motion on a political manner, in a particular manner. We are about, hopefully we will make sure that what we are doing is thoroughly vetted by the member states. We have gone to the Trade Policy Committee and other committees with possible outputs, but I think it will not need to be formalized with a mandate at this stage. Time is very short and we have to be pragmatic, but we want to bring the member states along, and the member states want this to happen. So as the European Parliament, if I may, and I'll let Bernd, who already said quite a number of things, I don't want to speak for him, but I think there is a lot of hope that we will get to a better cooperation through this instrument. It's been very positively received around almost everywhere. And now we'll have to make it work, and it will be done in close cooperation with all the stakeholders, the member states and the European Parliament, so we don't run the risk of being accused of being not transparent, not properly consulting and so on. Thanks.
Many thanks. I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to come in back on the WTO issue, and Bernd on the institutional issue. Maybe first let's go to Jennifer on the WTO, and then maybe go back on to the internal kitchen of the TTC.
Well, I'll only comment that I don't think there's anything that we can do to change the deadlines or the timing of the MC12, or at least that does not appear to be in the cards. And I would certainly share the view that I think it is unlikely that the United States is going to be in a position to move forward with major, sort of reforms or negotiated solutions, with the possible exception on fishery subsidies, where I think I am going to remain an optimist that MC12 can produce an agreement on to end, some of the most pernicious of the subsidies in the fisheries area. Other than that, I think the United States is not yet in a position. I mean, that Catherine Tai has not yet had her full team confirmed, while she has named, again, a very able and capable, dedicated USTR servant in Maria Pagan to be the U.S. ambassador to the WTO. That position has not yet been confirmed, nor has a lot of the rest of the team. And as a result, I think the United States is not yet in a position to move on this. So I think, to me, what ought to happen is a pivot towards a much more precise and dedicated roadmap for where do we go after MC12 in order to create pathways to reach solutions on the key WTO reform issues. And obviously, at the heart and soul of that reform of the WTO has got to be what is in the European Union's paper is, making sure that we can find a new common purpose for the WTO. I mean, it's very clear to me that the last, 50 plus years the WTO has been mostly about fighting discrimination on an MFN or national treatment basis. But it is very clear that that raison d'etre of the WTO now has to shift. And it has to shift to include the worker-centric things that we've been talking about. It has to shift to include sustainable development. It has to shift to include this ability to have the WTO be at the heart of fighting pandemics, climate change, etc. And so, to me, what would be a feasible, doable outcome is a roadmap to get there, not necessarily any specific agreements other than on fish.
Many thanks, Jennifer. Before turning to Bernd, maybe just quickly may ask Dan to comment on this, if you think that there are quick wins possible before the MC12 on fisheries, on, for example, maybe services, domestic regulation, which I think the US joined over the summer. And would you agree with the vision that, I mean, that maybe the best scenario is that the MC12 really develops a detailed program for WTO reform instead of really already, I don't know, coming with specific deliverables, or do I see this wrong?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, it's true that the focus of my remarks were on the newly launched bilateral high-level endeavor between the United States and the European Union to address a lot of the joint challenges that we face. That's sort of the nature of the moment that I'm in, and maybe my position as head of the Europe office dealing with the bilateral relations. But I think it is clear that the WTO, other multinational fora are extremely important, but they do need to be modernized to demonstrate that they can face today's challenges. I do know that Ambassador Tai feels that she has a very strong partner in the WTO DG right now. She very much looks forward to working with her to ensure that the institution remains strong, remains relevant, remains impactful in the 21st century. And we are working very hard towards a successful MC12, and as I said, more towards a more relevant and reformed WTO after the ministerial has concluded. It's simply a fact that I think reform at the WTO is needed if it's to continue to provide a viable forum for negotiating solutions. The negotiating function has very much lagged for various reasons, some of them having to do probably with the dispute settlement, but there are other areas. I mean, two key areas for reform are that we're working very closely on are members' transparency and with respect to special and differentiated treatment. There are a number of areas where the WTO does need to be reformed to make sure that it stays relevant. And I know that Ambassador Tai feels she has a strong partner in the Director General, and looks forward to continuing to work with her.
Many thanks, Dan. And sorry, Bernd, for keeping you waiting, but please come in. I think you still wanted to give a few comments on the internal kitchen
yeah, but also on the WTO. So we are really in the European Parliament preparing a resolution for the MC12, and the perspective is quite clear. We want to really go ahead with the multilateral system, and no doubt about we need some reforms, but first of all, we should really secure the result of MC12. So if there is not really an outcome, I guess then this institution is in real danger. So the fisheries, trade and health, and perhaps some starting points for the modernization has to be on the table at the end of MC12. Otherwise, the skepticism will really grow. And last week we had a discussion in my committee on WTO, and there was some tendency to try to find some alternatives to WTO. And therefore, I guess we should really be honest and ask the question, is this system really the system for the 21st century or not? But first of all, I guess we have to stabilize and secure the outcome of MC12, and then we have to discuss this quite honestly. And of course, the element Jennifer and Rupert mentioned, and then as well, so that we modernize and introduce more sustainability, the SDGs into the WTO is really important. Otherwise, I guess nobody outside this trade bubble will understand the work of WTO. So the idea to establish, for example, a working group on workers' rights in the frame of WTO would be one of the starting points to make more sustainability into WTO. On the Council and the Member States on TTC, I think this is really related to the fear that they are losing competence in the field of trade. We have always a discussion, is a trade agreement a mixed agreement or a union-only agreement, even knowing that the treaty and the ruling of the Court of Justice is quite clear. So therefore we need really dialogue and make clear where the competence is. And secondly, that this is not a trade agreement. This is a platform for reaching some concrete results so that the fears in the capitals are really not being on concrete facts.
Many thanks, Bernd. Now I will group a couple of questions to make it realistic for me and for you. And obviously, it's no surprise that we have a couple of questions on the Section 232 tariffs. For example, Kat Lucero from MLEX Washington is basically asking what is going on with the Section 232 tariffs, because what are the legal options? For example, if, for example, the EU definitely will exclude the option of voluntary export restraints, the option to turn these Section 232 tariffs in safeguard measures are also obviously not really realistic for political and legal reasons. So what are the options actually to get out of this issue? I think this is mainly then addressed to Rupert and Dan, but obviously Ben and Jennifer feel free to join. So that's the first question. And then secondly, I have several questions really on the climate issue and on the specific dedicated working groups on climate. For example, Sarah Jackson is asking, beyond CBAM, what can we expect from the TTC in terms of climate and the climate and green tech? Because indeed, obviously, the focus is now very much on CBAM and cooperation on CBAM, although I think the US is hardly covered or impacted by the CBAM proposal as it is currently on the table. So what are the priorities besides cooperation on carbon pricing in that area? And also a question related to that from my EPC colleague, I think, Thijs, to what extent would a non-agreement on cooperation on CBAM or carbon pricing really jeopardize the entire discussion on cooperation on climate issues? Maybe I start with these two questions. So the climate issue and Section 232. So maybe we can start the way around now with Rupert, if that is okay for you.
Yeah, of course it's okay for me, but what shall I say on 232? The option is just to lift the thing. Sorry, I'm a bit easy. We didn't impose that, and of course you could just lift them. Now, being a bit more serious, obviously there are very difficult questions. What you can actually do, and here I'm speaking a little bit like an American, to keep your steel industry alive or your aluminum industry alive in the face of this overcapacity issue, and not at the same time penalize the Europeans who are not the source of overcapacity. So some of the options were mentioned in the question. At the time we have certainly, and we said so publicly, for us this is a safeguard. The US of course disagrees, so I'm not going to dwell onto that. It's also true that we're not in the business of doing anything WTO illegal. And you all know that quantitative restrictions are not allowed under the WTO. So the conundrum is obviously well described. I think we will have to work very hard, but there is, I think, the willingness to work very hard. That's why we have created a working group. We're working on these issues. That's public knowledge. It's also public knowledge that we are working very intensely on all of that as we speak, because what I want to recall is that the EU has really, in our view, made a gesture to not impose the second tranche of our retaliation, if you wish. And I think it's full well now understood by all of us that now is the time to find a solution like we did on the other issue, of the Airbus Boeing issue. So I can't really tell you what the solutions will be because I don't know. But I can tell you that there is a lot of effort going into this in order to address the issue.
Many thanks, Rupert. But maybe Dan, you can come up maybe with finding the middle ground, or in any case going in that direction. I don't know if you have views on this or would like to comment on this.
Yeah. Well, on the 232 issue, the main challenge that we're facing, of course, is one of massive excess capacity globally. And we've mentioned China, but it's not just China. It's a significant problem, and it's a problem that has presented serious threats to us, and we believe trading partners. And it's something that we do have to face together. It's obviously very true and very visible that it has a tariff component, because to react to this huge challenge, the United States used this 1960 statute in order to take a protective measure. But it's fundamentally an issue of having to address some of the issues that I mentioned at the outset, which is, how do we protect ourselves against non-market economies that produce huge excess capacity and threaten our industries. And broadly speaking, I mean, the issue at hand, this particular issue, has to do with steel. But of course, the playbook is not just steel. The playbook is all the new industries to come, all the emerging technologies, including those that are critical to some of the need to address climate. So I think that's really the significant issue that we have to focus on. How do we address that underlying problem, and how can we best work together with our EU colleagues to address that problem? And then secondarily, how do we protect ourselves in the meantime? Which is why the simple solution of just lifting everything is a little oversimple. I will certainly agree with Rupert that the teams are working hard on this issue. I think the administration has a pretty good track record starting early on with trying to address a number of these the bilateral issues, the irritants that were mentioned at the outset, including digital services tax, including Airbus, Boeing, and ahead of the summit, we did commit to sitting down and trying to address this issue of steel excess capacity and 232. I, like Rupert, can't tell you where this is going to end up. I can tell you that the teams are, as directed by the political leadership, working very hard to find a resolution, and of course the time frames that are implicit in the European regulations on this are very much in mind. I don't know, Guillaume, do you want to circle back to the climate question too, or do you want to start again, or?
No, now that you have the floor, please go ahead. And if you also want to comment on indeed, to what extent, the question was, to what extent is the discussion on CBAM monopolizing the broader working group on climate and green tech, and what could be the other priorities? Please go ahead. And then I will definitely give Bernd and Jennifer the possibility to come back on Section 232 and maybe also the climate issue, if that is okay.
I do, yeah, thank you. I do think that, as Rupert said at the outset, the TTC is very broad, has 10 working groups dealing with a broad range of issues. One of them is the Clean Tech Working Group. I think a number of those groups, including the Clean Tech Working Group, are working together to define their scope of work and next steps. And so I can't really, I mean, clearly, there's a likelihood we'll be focusing on exchanging ideas on clean energy technologies and opportunities to support trade in low and zero carbon products and services. But I can't say specifically at this point what that working group will be dealing on. I will say, since there has been some discussion of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I mean, I think it's been clear that the Biden-Harris administration is committed to taking a whole of government approach to addressing climate change, and Ambassador Tai, I think, very much believes that trade tools, because we're the trade agency, we're not the climate agency, but we do believe that trade tools can very much be leveraged to address the climate crisis. And this includes how trade tools can be used to advance our ambitions to support a global transition to lower emission economies as we pursue the goals of the Paris Agreement. We're, of course, very aware of initiatives and discussions in the European Union on these areas. And I think, the force of the Trade and Technology Council and other discussions is to have a forum to talk about these issues and to sort out how best to pursue our common objectives, even as, and I think Jennifer also referred to this, although I wouldn't necessarily consider it a negative, it's just it's a fact of our relationship that often we pursue the same tools same objectives rather, using different tools. And I think one of the things that we can do is make sure that through discussion that we correctly pursue those goals, even if we're doing things slightly differently. I mean, part of the art of the US-EU relationship is managing our very different institutions and our different means of trying to achieve similar objectives. So we are, I think, closely engaged with our EU counterparts on this and other issues.
Sorry, many thanks, Dan. And Bernd and Jennifer, would you like to come in on section 232 or this climate CBAM issue?
On both, yeah. On the steel issue, of course, the European Parliament is a little bit nervous about the situation because the tariffs, of course, are not in the frame of WTO. They are not anti-dumping. This is, in our point of view, illegal. And even knowing this, we made some steps in the direction of the United States. So I just remind everybody that we adopted a legislation that lobsters from Maine can be imported to a European Union without tariffs. So this was a unilateral measure towards the United States. Or on the quotas regarding WTO, the TRQ, we go ahead went ahead with the proposals of the United States and accepted this as well. So we made some moves, and hopefully now on the steel tariffs we can also see some moves on the US side. So I can also understand the domestic situation inside the United States, specifically in Ohio and other Rust Belt states. No doubt about it. I spoke also with the trade unions and the steelworker unions. But let's try to find a compromise, so that both sides can really go ahead with the solution which is benefiting the domestic situation. But we need really a move. And on climate, yeah, I guess the goal is, of course, to increase the production of renewable energy. And therefore, there are a lot of possibilities to really find a common approach on the regulatory framework. I guess this is sometimes an obstacle for the production of renewable energy, or the certification process of different items, or the question of tariffs as well on goods and services. So there are possibilities to really increase renewable energy, and also the question of the switch to the hydrogen-based economy is an important discussion tool. We need some standards on hydrogen as well. So this is also another opportunity, and even the question of import and export of hydrogen. So I would really appreciate not to receive LNG from fracking from the United States, but hydrogen produced by renewable energy from the United States. So I guess there are a lot of elements beside the question of CBAM. And on CBAM, of course, we will discuss this quite intensively in the Parliament as well. Firstly, the question of WTO compatibility, I guess we have to reflect is it really wise to put the revenue of the CBAM into the budget of the European Union, or should the revenue go into climate project domestically or in our partner countries, which fits more into GATT Article 20, I guess. Secondly, what's about the equivalence of measures? And everybody is knowing that the United States will never, perhaps never, but not in a reasonable time frame, a CO2 price or an emission trading system. But of course, we need to discuss some equivalency. I guess Jennifer will present the proposal of a climate custom union or something like that, that we can really recognize equivalent measures inside the United States or in other countries as well. And thirdly, regarding the developing world. So we should also reflect how we can support the economic development and also really the switch to more CO2 neutral production. So regarding, for example, the import of cement, it's coming mainly into the European Union from Tunisia and Morocco. And I guess we want to support the economic development in these countries for several reasons. And we can really cut down the economic relations. So therefore, we have to discuss the CBAM proposal quite intensively in the next years. The proposal by the Commission has a, let's say, grace period from 5 years. So I guess we should find some possibilities to make it really complicated to the other engagement in CO2 reduction.
Many thanks, Bernd. And before going to another final round of questions, Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to come in on Section 232 or CBAM or.
Well, on 232, I guess I'm not going to comment because I think it is in the process of negotiations. I mean, obviously, the only sort of reported rumors, and truly they are, reported rumors, is this idea of going down the road of a tariff rate quota that would allow shipments up to certain levels coming into the United States, and then above that level, obviously, then there would be a tariff imposed. Don't know, and I'm not going to say I'm not a part of those discussions. On the climate front, I will say, to me, there's a huge amount of work for this particular committee of the TCC on climate and green technology to do a whole lot. I mean, to me, part of it is the technical work of trying to figure out whether you can say that whatever the United States has done in its regulatory incentive mix is close enough to the equivalent of what Europe is doing in its emissions trading system, that neither side should be imposing carbon border adjustments on one another. I mean, can you come to even that sort of basic sense of what I'll call a peace clause or an agreement that if you are reaching the same goal by a different path, we're going to acknowledge each other's path as functionally equivalent enough that we are not going to impose additional taxes or tariffs or measures on one another. That is one just sort of way in which this could get resolved sort of early on and quickly, and would be a signal to the rest of the world to think about this, to think about how do we measure what is the equivalent. But to me, there's just so much more that this committee could do. I mean, whether it is trying to figure out a way to create a ban on fossil fuel subsidies, or again, at least a clear process for phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies, whether it could do more in terms of the degree to which there is still a lot of both private and, at least coming out of China and some other places, government financing of coal-fired power plants. Is there a way, again, to create disciplines on both private and to some degree public sector, or certainly public support of private money that is going into coal-fired power plants? Is there a way to do that? Is there a way, again, on the straight up technology fronts, again, to create consortiums that are available to provide this kind of green technology, recognizing that right now, again, the #1 producer of solar, of geothermal, of wind is coming out of China. And again, how are we going to work out an arrangement between the United States, the European Union, and the others? I mean, Japan has a big role to play in a lot of this clean technology as well. But again, it is this issue of not only within our own borders, but how is it that the United States and the European Union can work together to build clean power plants in much of the developing world, where in the absence of a US-EU presence, what is happening is China is building coal-fired power plants. So we need, again, across a whole series of issues that are not necessarily connected to CBAM. And there's a lot more for this committee to do than simply focus on a potential dispute over a US-EU approach.
Many thanks, Jennifer, for taking the focus of CBAM. Actually, time flies, so I will collect a couple of questions, maybe a bit too much to tackle them in one round, but I will group them, and then I will actually give you all a kind of a final word, and then it's up to you to pick and choose the questions that you aim to cover. And obviously there is a kind of a mix between specific questions on the TTC and broader issues, questions on substance. On the internal kitchen of the TTC and transparency, Leah Offray from Beuk, so the consumer organization, is asking basically to Rupert and Dan questions related to transparency. Will the Commission publish, like it is doing, for example, for negotiations on trade agreements, will it publish agendas and minutes of the TTC working groups and meetings, and provide civil society organizations the options to give recommendations? So that's one question related to transparency and involvement of civil society. A bit related to that, but zooming out, a second question is, to what extent is it already explored that like-minded third countries can be involved in specific working groups of the TTC on many issues? Is this too early to say something on this, or was this already discussed, how and to what extent third countries can be involved in these discussions? So transparency, secondly, third countries. And then maybe a final broad question, which gives you the opportunity, again, to go any direction that you want. But Robert Francis from Borderlegs and several other people ask, what is the low-hanging fruit, or what actually would be a success, or what are the conditions for a successful meeting in Pittsburgh? Or actually, what does success look like is the question to the EU and US with regard to the inaugural meeting. So what are the key priorities, what is low-hanging fruit, and when actually would both the EU and US will be satisfied with the first meeting, and would be when would this meeting will be a success? So questions on transparency, involvement of third countries, and a broad question on low-hanging fruit, and when actually would the TTC be considered the inaugural meeting as a success? I will, because I think this one is definitely, I think, aimed also for Jennifer from Elisa Baroncini from the University of Bologna. Will the US put something on paper on the appellate body reform? When and if? A specific question that I just squeeze in. So we have these 4 questions. If something is not clear, please let me know. But maybe I do just a tour de table and start. I don't know if they are candidates to start, but maybe I start this time with Bernd. I don't know if you want to kick off.
On transparency, of course, I expect that.
Not all at once, please. Let's.
Sorry, Rupert, we didn't hear you.
My connection. Let Bernd start. My connection is sort of faltering right now. Anyway.
Okay. So on transparency, of course, I expect that the Commission will publish, as we agreed in general during the TTIP negotiation, the protocols and the agenda of the meetings on their website, so that all the doubts about intransparent exercise will really not have any reason more. And this is really, I guess, important. It's a totally different approach, and we are going ahead with this different approach, and transparency is really, really key. And the success of the exercise, I guess, in Pittsburgh, there is much more a diplomatic event and the starting point. And then, of course, I expect that the different working groups will try to agree on a specific timeline, and then perhaps in half a year, we will have a result on a common exchange of experience and criteria, for example, in the question of investment screening, and perhaps in other working groups, we will have success in a little bit more time. Of course, we will have an important event in the United States at the end of the next year, and we will have also an important election besides the German election in France next year. So I guess some elements are also related to the political exercise we have, but I'm convinced that the working groups should really try to start with the timeline in Pittsburgh. So not overestimate the result of Pittsburgh, but then the hard work is starting.
Many thanks, Bernd. Maybe if it is okay for you, Rupert, I turn to you so that we can give our friends at the other side of the Atlantic the final word. Would that be okay for you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's fine. And I wanted to make one additional remark on what Jennifer had said about climate, CBAM, and so on. I think we should all keep our the focus on trying to have a very, very educated debate on the CBAM issue. Obviously, all the problems and issues and possible pitfalls have been called out. No carbon price, very different approaches, innovation or technology versus regulation, and so on. Incentives. What I want to make the point is the following. The way the proposal came out is already crafted in a way that there will be, from a trade side, a minimal impact compared to what was discussed before. I can be quite blunt on this. We have tried to make sure that it's not discriminatory and so on. Not least the whole WTO canon, if you wish, of things. But I do think the more important point is there is a real willingness to have a dialogue with our partners before this thing comes on stream. Because we realize that if we don't do that, it doesn't help us, it doesn't help the world, it doesn't help the climate either if we have big fights about these things. So already now, the EVP who's responsible for this, Timmermans, is talking to John Kerry to see what, and it's also coming up in our work here. We don't know exactly where and how, but it's been surely flagged as an issue of interest. But what I'm worried about, and this is why I make the point, we don't want this to distract from all the other issues which have been mentioned. This is a huge issue, climate and tech and trade. And we really have to focus it to where we can work together positively, while not neglecting the possible problems we might have. And there, I think a lot of stuff has been said, what can be done. I think Jennifer put out a number of very pertinent issues here. There are many more. We're also starting to talk about, I've mentioned the WTO angle, which I think is important. The whole subsidy regime is clearly part of it. Finding a way on financing alternative projects, because right now we're not in the league of China, let's be honest. They are much better at bringing together technology, finance, and everything that you need for a big project. And that is something we both realize, and that's why we're working on this also in different contexts. All right, I'll be quiet now, but I think it's really important to make that point, that we should not only stare at this CBAM issue and lose sight, which of course we will not, of the rest. Civil society, yes, I mean, and Bernd's comment on transparency, we will publish, that's pretty much sure. We'll not go back on what we did in TTIP, to be very transparent, and I think it might be also easier because we don't have a real negotiation where we exchange concessions on tariffs that might be sensitive for some of our constituencies. Just to give an example. Third countries, there is of course interest, and some of the things we are discussing are linked to the trilateral discussion we've had. We want to be also transparent vis-a-vis third countries and see, I don't have a silver crystal ball, but we will certainly talk about what we're doing here in an open manner with those who share our approach to some of these issues. And lastly, what is the success? I mean, it's going to be in the eye of the beholder as always, but we want to have a mix of forward-looking, clear agenda setting, political signaling that we are jointly addressing these issues, but also a few what we call more tangible deliverables that are still in the making to show that we're not only talking, but we're also walking the talk, which is very difficult given the very little time we've had. But I think Bernd is right to say a clear marching order and sense of direction, concrete, granular things in work programs and communication is what we're looking for on top of all of the other things we've discussed. Thank you.
Sorry. Many thanks, Rupert, for your comments. Jennifer, I don't know if I can turn to you now. Sorry, you're still muted.
Given the hour, I'm going to try to be very, very quick and very brief. On the low-hanging fruit, I mean, what could we expect? I mean, to me, you know, I would echo something that Bernard Lange just said, which is, you know, there's some of the areas that we haven't touched on where I actually think progress could be made fairly quickly on investment screening, on export controls. That's one of the other working groups where I think there is a lot more commonality already in place. So something serious on that. And I think there's been a big push in the United States, and I think could be extended to an agreement on something with respect to shoring up the semiconductor supply chain, where I think there is a lot of emphasis and a lot of work and a lot of urgency behind it. And then, like I said, for me, I would put on this agenda the idea of at least coming to some common understandings of not going after each other for whatever may come out in carbon border measures, at least, you know, for a period of time until something else can be worked out. And then I'll only comment quickly on the question about the appellate body reform. I don't see anything happening in the very near term. And again, I think there was a big push and a big effort, and I certainly commend the work that Ambassador David Walker did to try to sort of outline exactly what the U.S. concerns were perceived to be and how they could be responded to. I think it's clear that at least from the United States side, that was not enough. And the area in which I think there would need to be some further work done is what to do about the existing jurisprudence with respect to trade remedies, because to me, it's very clear that the vast majority of the United States' complaints about the appellate body decisions are decisions that had the effect of restricting the ability to use trade remedies. And so I think the discussion is going to have to move into what do you do about those decisions? You know, in essence, can they be undone, or can we start with any kind of a different slate with respect to that? That is not something that can be done in the very near term. So I think that means that the need and the desire to reform the appellate body is going to be one of those issues that's going to be a ways further down the road.
Many thanks, Jennifer, also for identifying the key issue on the appellate body reform. And so then finally, Mr. Mullaney, you have the final word. So again, please feel free to pick the questions as you like.
Great. Well, thank you, Guillaume, and thanks to everybody for participating, fellow panelists, everybody who's attending. I think Rupert mentioned part of this, a big part of this exercise is having a dialogue with the partners before we do things. And I think that's really is sort of the core of what we're trying to do in the TTC. Set up an in-depth dialogue to make sure that where we have common objectives, we can pursue them in a coordinated way that avoids collateral damage as much as possible. It applies to the issue that Rupert was talking about at the moment, but I think it applies across the board. I mean, that really is the objective here. I think another thing worth focusing on the question of like-minded countries is that, you know, the TTC is essentially it's a bilateral forum for the United States and the European Union. We do have a lot of like-mindeds, and I think you know, the TTC is not the only tool in our toolbox for trying to pursue our efforts. Rupert mentioned the trilateral discussions we've had in the past. We have obviously the whole WTO and WTO Reform Agenda, which is you know, not specifically part of a bilateral engagement with the European Union. So we have many tools out there, and I think there are plenty of opportunities to work with like-minded allies outside of the US-EU relationship. And I think that is going to be very important. On transparency, I mean, we do intend very much to have this be a very transparent exercise. We want to be inclusive in terms of input. We want to be communicative in terms of what we're doing and what our objectives are. I can't specifically say whether there are going to be minutes, so I can't really say whether those are going to be published, but we are going to find every way we can to be as transparent as we can. In terms of success, I think, you know, if we manage to both define, identify, and set a path for concrete outcomes with respect to all of the objectives of the TTC, I think that's I think that we can count that as a success. And then as we move forward, ideally we accomplish more concrete outcomes as we go, and we identify a path for further concrete outcomes. So I think I will stop there. There's obviously a lot more to discuss, but I want to thank everybody for appearing on the panel with me, and also for attending, and you, Guillaume, and NEPC for sponsoring what I think was a really excellent, deep, profound, rich debate. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dan, and yeah, indeed, I'm afraid we run out of time, and on my behalf and also on behalf of EPC, I really want to thank all speakers for their comments, sharing their views, and indeed, on some issues it was too early, and we will have to see what will come out of the first meeting. And obviously, we at the side of EPC will be following what you all will be cooking up in your different positions, and we will definitely organize new events and output on that. So many thanks. Also, many thanks for all the participants for joining, and sorry that I didn't manage to collect all the questions. And indeed, I mean, we covered many issues, but just to say that we even indeed didn't cover issues such as supply chains, export controls, investment screening. So just to say that we will meet again. So I hope. So I can only wish you in DC or in Brussels or wherever, Strasbourg, having a very nice day, and I hope to see you soon. Many thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.